Welcome to the Air Emission Inventory Best Practices. Today we're going to cover a quick source review and data updates. This class is not going to teach you how to do an AEI. It's just going to kind of hit the high points and pitfalls involved with completing an AEI. If you need to know how to do an AEI, there are week-long classes that I suggest you sign up for on SurveyMonkey. And if you need the link, just let me know and I can send it out to you. Today, we're going to talk about source review, data updates. We're going to talk about usage documentation, emission calculations, and then we're just going to barely touch up on the quality assurance and quality control portion involved with that. For those of you that are interested in the quality assurance, quality control part of your AEI, please sign up for the webinar that will be held next week, where we will focus only on quality assurance and quality control. Okay, so I refer you to that. All right, source review. So prior to any AEI, you need to know what you have. So I know that some installations do a good job of periodically throughout the year making sure that they know about new sources that have come on the base. They know about sources that have been removed. But Air Force bases are very large, and chances are there may be one shop out there that got a new degreaser or a new blast booth, or they changed out the controls on something, or they removed a source and you're not aware of it. So my recommendation is the first thing that you should do is you should find out what exactly do I have, where does it say that I have it, and then start sending out lists to the shops or even going out to the shops and double checking, hey, do I know that this is still here? Okay. Now, there are some reports to use to help with this. The first one is called the Active Stationary Sources with Equipment. So that's just kind of a basic report. And then there's another one that's called AEI Collection and Summary Reports. So I'm going to go into APIMS real quick and show you where these are. If you were to try and look through all of the data in the front end of APIMS to double check everything, it would take an inordinate amount of time. These reports are designed to help streamline that process, put all the data in one place, and help you quickly identify any data gaps that you may have. Okay. So if I go into APIMS and I go to Reports, Custom, and hopefully this will run quickly. If not, I do have Excel downloads of these reports, but hopefully APIMS is going to work okay for me today. And if you go to Folders, and like I said, the file path is on the slides and I can send those out after the class. You want to go to Public Folders, Public APIMS Reports, PMO Reports, which is Program Management Office Reports, Air Quality. And most of the reports we're going to talk about today are going to be in the quality assurance folder. So the reports I was talking about were active stationary sources with equipment. So if I click on that, now because this is a shared report, if I come into this report, it's going to have the data for the installation that it last was run for. Okay, so it may or may not be your data. So the first thing you need to do is click the refresh button up here. Okay, and so as you can see, this one, it's separated out by facility. So this base has a couple different facilities. So that way you can segregate out your different air permits or reporting requirements. And it provides a list even of your storage tanks. It's got the EUID, which is the base specific ID, unique process, tells you whether it's a permitted source. And then if there is equipment associated, it's going to tell you some key data about that equipment. Okay. Any questions about this report? It's kind of nice, gives you a quick review of, where is it located? And what types of sources do you have?
Hey, Julie. Julie, how do I change the base since I have several bases?
So this report is, if you're several bases, what you want to do is you want to edit your profile. Well, actually, are you a tier? Sorry, who asked the question? I couldn't see.
Sorry, it's Amy. I have tier 2 and 3.
Okay, so if you're tier 2, so if you're tier 3, it'll run it just for that installation that you're assigned to. Okay. If you're tier 2, it will run it for all of the installations that you're assigned to. So you can get them all in one if you want. I would try and run it at tier 3. If not, I can add a filter to this. Right now, I don't have it filtered on installation, but you could come up to the edit and just add a filter on facility name, and then that would do that. So I can actually, make this a prompt. So then it'll come up and you can then select which one you want. And actually, I'll just save that this way.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so this is a good basic report. It's good for that just kind of like, high level view of it, but at least it gives you an idea of what you have, what's your starting point. Now, the other report that I really, really like that I recommend is in that same folder. We're going to go back to this one, and it's a very large report. This is for more for you guys to work off of when you're collecting usage and to double check. And it's a real in-depth look at what you have. So under the quality assurance, now it had to be broken up into 2 different reports because of the size of it. So we're just going to look at one of them, but it's this AEI collection and summary report. So if we click on that, and I'm not going to rerun the, well, I probably should rerun this. I'll rerun it and see. There we go. Okay, so this one does prompt you for the base for this one, so that should work well for you, Amy. Hopefully it'll come up real quick. If not, if it takes a few minutes, then I will pull up the Excel version that I exported. Unfortunately, I'm hesitating to use Excel, I have to tell you, because my computer, for some reason, is not functioning properly, and Excel seems to be the cause of some of the problems I've been having with it. And I don't want to have to restart in the middle of it. So as you can see, though, in the background, the first section is going to be process information. So that's going to be, what's the source category code, what's the base specific, local process name, what's the location. It even talks about usage interval. So do I need to collect monthly usage or annual usage for this source? And then it's going to provide you with any of the authorized materials on it. So it's a real good look at what is this process, what kind of data do I need to collect, and how often do I need to collect it. Then the next section goes into the equipment information. So that's going to tell you, the process, the model serial number, equipment type, things like that. And I'll show you that here in just a second when the data comes up. And then for those, there's another section for parameter information. This is not key for every single process, but for those processes that require it, such as your external combustion processes, it can tell you what your total rated capacity is, and just gives you a look at all the key data that's involved with that process and emission calculation. The next section is calculation methodology. So this is going to tell you what calculations is it associated with, what algorithm codes is it using, what's the algorithm formula, and what emission factors are being used. Okay. And then the bottom one, which I'll show you in here in just a minute, is the usage summary. So this is going to say over the last several years, what has the usage been? And this is going to provide it by material and by unit of measure. And actually, I'm not going to wait for this. I'm just going to pull up my Excel version of this report. So here is what the report looks like. So this is what I was saying. You've got your process information. So for abrasive blasting, we know this is plastic media. And then if I go over here, it even in the equipment tab, it even lets me know if I have a control on it. And if so, what is the control efficiency and what pollutants is it controlling? Okay, so this is very important to make sure for those types of sources such as ABCL or woodworking, What types of controls do I have on it? Am I taking account for what I have? And then, like I said, the parameter information, the calculation methodology, it's going to tell you what algorithms are associated and what the emission factors are. Okay. And then this is the one that you really need to focus on for the AEI. So that's all kind of the static data that stays the same year to year, but you do need to review that data to make sure that nothing changed and make sure that you didn't miss anything. Okay. But this bottom grid shows you the usage. So I can tell you that, in 2007, it used this much. And so that way I can kind of get an idea of what usage would I expect this year, right? And so you can kind of compare it. You can even send this out to the shop personnel and say, last year you gave me this. And we'll talk more about some of the good strategies in interfacing with some of your shop level personnel to get the usage as well. And then down at the bottom, each source category is going to have its own specific tab. Okay. Any questions about this report and how useful it can be when trying to do your AEI? Okay. All right, then I'm going to bounce back to the slides. Okay, so those are my two reports that I highly recommend that you use to look at what data do I have, what data did I use last year. So review that list. It may involve contacting the shop personnel to say, hey, can you confirm that you still have these sources? It may involve going out and saying, is this degreaser still there? Do you still have this blast booth? That kind of thing, right? Now, for if equipment has been removed, you need to end date the equipment and the processes. One of the common things that we see is that people will end date the process, but leave the equipment active. Okay, so you have to make sure to do both steps of the end dating. The other thing is that it's very, very common that equipment is end dated and no comment is put into the status change on the process tab. And then somebody comes in behind and says, well, no, that source is there. Why did they end date it? And there's no comment. And so if you're end dating something, I highly recommend as a best practice, add a comment. Say confirmed source was removed during 2023 effort, confirmed from shop personnel. I know some installations will even put the initials of the person that end dated it so that somebody can, follow up questions. But the comments are key, especially if, like, for example, Amy, you're an ISS, so you have multiple bases. It would be nice for you to be able to go in and look at those comments and say, oh, okay, this was on purpose, right? Or if you're end dating it because let's say you had a duplicate process, somebody created the same source twice, end date one and say, source still exists. However, this is a duplicate record in the database. That kind of comment is very, very valuable. So I recommend you do that. And then once again, configure all your new sources and equipment. Now, if you have questions on how to configure new sources and equipment, there's a lot of resources out there. There's the APIMS AEI procedure guide. So I'm just going to show you where that is real quick. If you come up here to help and system documentation, so help guides, and if you go to AFCEC documents, there is, let me see if I can find it, the APIMS AEI procedure guide. It's going to step-by-step walk you through how to create a new process, an equipment record. It also has data collection sheets that you can print out and take to the shop with you, and it'll walk you through all the key data elements that you're going to need for that type of source. So that when you get back to your office to create it in APIMS, you have all the key data that you need. You asked all the right questions when you're there, and so you're not having to go back and forth. So I recommend you utilize that. And then there's also the help desk. So if you have a question, you can call and do that. Okay, any questions about that? And then for those of you that haven't gone to the AEI class, I believe we're having an AEI class in a couple weeks. We'll have another one, I believe, in April, March or April. So I recommend that you sign up for that. Okay. Any questions about source review? Okay. So we're going to talk, I kind of talked about the AEI collection and summary report. So with that first section of the process information, you want to confirm the status of the processes. This is something I didn't talk about, but it is useful to confirm the authorized materials. Make sure that this is right, that you didn't change it over to something else. For abrasive blasting, for example, if they were using glass beads and now they're plastic media, make sure that you're accounting for that, okay? And then equipment information. This is one of the things that's the hardest to keep up, especially with boilers. But you need to, with boilers, it's very, very important that you review all of the equipment, make sure that it's correct, end date the equipment that is not there anymore, make sure that you've added the new equipment, make sure that key data elements are populated. So depending on what type of source it is, if it's a boiler, you want to make sure, did you capture the rated capacity? If it is an internal combustion engine, we won't even get into it. There's a lot of key data that you need to capture for that. If it's a new paint booth, did you get the control efficiency of the filters? That kind of stuff. So you want to make sure that the key elements are populated. And then for parameter information, that's another thing that I want to touch on real quick, is that when you're in the unique process area and the parameters, so let's just go into AECOM. We're going to look at base-wide. So this is especially true with base-wide boilers, okay? So boilers are constantly changing out, which can affect your total rated capacity, which plays into your potential to emit. So if you go to the calculation tab and you have the parameters here, so you can see this has been done correctly. So from 2019 or 2005 to 2018, the total capacity at the installation was 783 million BTUs per hour. In 2019 to 2021, you can see they must have removed a lot of boilers, okay? But then in 2022, they had 642. So you can see that this number has changed. But what they didn't do was they didn't just go in and edit this number, and they didn't delete the number. They did this correctly. So when you have a parameter change, you want to end date the current parameters that's there and create a new one for that year. And the reason for doing that is because if you were ever to rerun the calcs for this time frame, you would rerun it with the number that was correct for this year, not the number that was correct for the year that you did the AEI, right? So for data tracking purposes and consistency, you need to have traceability of what that parameter was in that year that you ran the calc, okay? Any questions about that? Okay. So let's talk about, well, we'll talk about AECOM in a little bit. I don't want to get too far ahead. So that's what the parameter information is. And then calculation methodology, make sure that you're using the correct algorithm and emission factor sets. And I'll talk about it a little bit later on some specific sources, but you need to know what unit of measure am I tracking the usage in, and what unit of measure is the algorithm expecting. We find a lot of mismatch in that, especially with like surface coating and miscellaneous chemical, pesticide, that kind of stuff. Like I said, I'll touch on it a little bit later in more detail. The other one that I would want you to be wary of is the internal combustion algorithms and our emission factor sets. I believe they've all been remapped to where they're using the correct newer emission factors, but just review those and make sure that the emission factor set you've chosen matches the rated horsepower of the engine, the cylinder displacement, and the model year. So that one is kind of tricky. There's a lot of factors there. So it's good to double check that. And then the usage summary can be used to compare previous years to make sure this year is within reason. So for example, with my abrasive blasting booth, if I use 600 pounds last year, I wouldn't expect that I used 6,000 pounds this year, right? So you want to make sure that the numbers are, within reason of each other. Unless there was a emission change, you should be fairly consistently within a certain range or certain threshold for your usage, okay? And that you're going to kind of have to feel out, but it should not be orders of magnitude different. And if it is, then you need to start asking additional questions, right? Because that's gonna cause an increase in your emissions, and you need to be able to understand that to explain it when you submit your AEI or when you talk to a regulator. Okay, now for data collection strategies. So like I said, one of the good ways that I've seen people do is they will, pull this out and say, hey, for building, they'll talk to the person in building 1 and say, hey, these are your processes. This is the usage that you gave me last year. This is the usage you gave me last year. Could you please fill in? And they'll insert a blank line here. Insert a blank row for this year and say, could you please tell me what your sources emitted? That way they've got a reference of what kind of data you're looking for. So that's one strategy. Another strategy that has worked well is, these are some examples. So dust collection waste, you talk to the shop manager, you say, in last year, your shop reported the disposal of this many pounds of waste. Can you please tell me what it is this year? So putting it in an email format is good. And then another one for fuel transfer. Fuel transfer is very difficult, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. But in this one, they spell out all the different types of things that need to be done. And then the nice part about doing these with the emails is if you just save them in a file folder, then you've got the point of contact, and you've got the same template that you use every single month or every single year when collecting it. And the people in the shops that provide the data get used to that consistent form of communication, and then everybody's on the same page, okay? Another one that has worked, and I took this one from, I believe it's Cape Canaveral. Yeah, Cape Canaveral space. This is the report that the POL shop gives them, right? And so in the air quality management office, they have it color coded to say, okay, when I see this number, when I see this number, I know that it goes to FDSP process and it's gasoline, and it's the total of these two issues. And so it's all color coded according to where the usage is going to go and explained, so that year to year, when they get this report, they know exactly which storage tanks and which fuel loading and fuel dispensing processes it goes to. Okay, so it's a really good step in continuity. As staff changes over at the base level, as fence to fence contract personnel changes over, as fence to fence contracts roll over, this is an invaluable resource to be able to have these kinds of things. Another thing that you can do is, if you have a template that you use to get usage for this particular process, put it on the records tab. So then the next year, or when the next person comes in, they can click on the record and say, okay, this is what I do to collect usage from it, and so on and so forth. Or put it in some sort of like guide that says, this is all the points of contact for all the different shops, and this is what you're looking for, okay? All right, now we're gonna dive into some source category specific type issues, and I'm just gonna hit kind of the major source categories. So we're going to start out with external combustion, because it contributes probably the highest emissions of any single source category. So the first thing and the most difficult thing is your boiler inventory up to date? And the next thing is, have you configured your boiler processes according to how fuel is consumed and tracked? Okay, so I have seen this done so many different ways. Some installations have a single process to a single boiler, and they'll have 200 boiler processes, but not all of those boilers are metered. So what they're doing is they're taking the base-wide gas number and then dividing it by the capacity and entering a whole bunch of consumption records. That is time consuming and not worth your while. So what you want to do is, if you only have natural gas boilers on your installation, you don't have any metered boilers, you want one process, okay? If you have different areas, so let's go into APIMS real quick, and I'm going to pick on Lackland's data. So Lackland has a scenario where they have a couple different areas that have natural gas boilers coming at them. And then in the past, they had some main power plant type boilers. So you can see that they've got their boilers according to how the meters are. That way, when you talk to the energy manager, you say, what are the different usage, or what's the natural gas bill for this area? Okay. Now, if you do have some dual fuel metered boilers, it used to be that you had to have them in separate processes. So you can see that for TEP boiler 1, we had a diesel process, and then we had to set up a natural gas process, right? But I'm going to show you something, and I don't know if everybody knows this. Right now, you have the functionality to where, so this is the natural gas, right? So let's go in and edit this. I can say, I want all of the natural gas usage to go to this algorithm. And I can save that. And then I can create another process assignment for, I think it's AECOM 2. AECOM 2, and we're just going to pick a random. I know that data is not right. I was just picking it quick. And we can say diesel. So now I don't have authorized material of diesel, but if I did, I could put the diesel. APIMS will then know that if I enter a usage record with diesel, it will apply only to this algorithm. If I have usage for natural gas, it'll apply to the other algorithm. Does that make sense? Has anybody seen this functionality yet or made use of it? I don't know if anybody on this call has dual fuel boilers, but it's going to make it a lot easier. So if you have dual fuel boilers, I suggest you get rid of the two processes and consolidate it down to a single process using that functionality. Okay. All right. The next thing I'm going to talk about is natural gas. Now, one of the problems that we had with natural gas was we were counting them incorrectly. So we would just say they're probably all uncontrolled, right? Which was causing a huge spike in emissions. We did a project where we went out and assisted some bases where we did a boiler inventory and accurately captured how many boilers had low NOx burners, how many had ultra low NOx burners, and configured the data in there to take into account that in the emission factors. And I can tell you that the uncontrolled emission factor for NOx is 100 pounds per million BTU. The low NOx is 30. So that's a 70% decrease in emissions from just capturing the data of what you already have. And I think overall we saw a 30% drop in NOx emissions when we went out to installations and did that. So for AECOM, this is the newest way of calculating. And if you haven't done this, I highly recommend it. It will make a big difference in your annual air emissions. Okay. So what you do for this is you have a total rated capacity of boilers. So that's what's my total heat capacity for the installation. And then you have low NOx capacity, ultra low NOx capacity, and uncontrolled capacity. So these have to be configured as parameter values here. And then you assign a series of algorithms that then ratios it. So AECOM 13 takes your capacity of ultra low NOx as a percentage of the total capacity and multiplies it by the low NOx factor, and so on and so forth. Now, with this methodology, you only have to enter one usage number, but it's going to apply all of those controls and give you the credit for them and using the right emission factors. Okay. Now, to do this, though, let's go look at equipment. So if I was to look at equipment, let's see if I can see it here. It's captured on the equipment type. So let's go look at this piece of equipment to make sure that you know how to account for that low NOx and ultra low NOx. So when you set up your boiler and you go to equipment type, oh, that one's a water heater. So anyway, but there's an equipment type here, and you can add equipment type of low NOx boiler, ultra low NOx, or uncontrolled. Okay. So I'm going to go back to business objects and show you a report. And it's going to be in that quality assurance folder again, and it's going to be boiler and cooling tower capacity. Now, if you run this report, I'm not going to confuse business objects. I'm going to show you the report that I pulled earlier today. This report will take care of it and sum it up for you. Okay, if you go to boiler capacity by type comparison, if you have configured all your boilers as you're inventorying them with the right equipment type, it will then say these are all of the low NOx boilers. This is all of their heat or rated heat capacities, and this is your total low NOx boiler capacity. Ultra low NOx, same thing. So at the end of the year, if you've been doing your inventory correctly, you can come in, run this report, and it will pull right here and say for this process, this is the current parameter value, and this is the current equipment capacity. And this is a rounding error, but the report is supposed to show a bright red when the two numbers don't match up. Okay. So like I said, it would be very time consuming to sit there and go through all of this. So we've created a report. All you have to do is make sure that your boiler inventory is correct and accurate in APIMS, and the report will do all of the work for you. Okay. Any questions about some of the changes in how best to configure boilers in APIMS? Now, if you are not confident in your boiler inventory, and you need, it's not part of your fence to fence contract to inventory all of the boilers on a yearly basis, or you need a rebaseline, please reach out to your ISS RSBs that can reach out to AFCEC. There is support to do one-time boiler rebaselines. Like I said, we did a bunch of them a couple years ago, and we saw on average a 30% decrease in NOx emissions. So I highly recommend that. That is a worthwhile exercise. And then once you've got the new values, make sure you update your parameters. Like I said, you don't edit the parameter, you don't delete the parameter, you create a new one and end date the old one, right? Couple other pitfalls, potential data sources. Make sure that you're talking to everybody that may or may not have boilers. It may not just be your HVAC on shop or HVAC shop on base that manages some of the heat input. You may need to talk to fuels management. You may need to go to your energy manager to get that natural gas information. And then sometimes tenant organizations or hospitals or clinics will kind of have their own separate thing. So just make sure you're aware of all of the different areas that manage the natural gas usage or metered boilers, things like that. Okay. Now, if you do have metered boilers, but you only have one natural gas number coming in at the fence line. So let's say that you just have one meter at the base, and then you've got a separate meter on two boilers at building one. What you need to do is get the total natural gas usage that comes into the building, into the base, and then subtract out what building one used. Otherwise, you're going to be double counting the usage for those particular boilers, okay? So when you're doing your base-wide number, you want to subtract out all your metered boiler gas use. Okay, that's another common mistake that we see. Any other questions about AECOM before we move on to the next source category? Okay, yeah, I wanted to talk about it because there's a lot of changes that have happened to the AECOM screens over the last several years. All right, everybody's favorite topic, internal combustion engines. So first and foremost, make sure that all emergency generators are entering monthly inspections in the APIMS facility power module. Okay, and that, I'm sure everyone is aware, is being tracked on the utilization report. So that should be being done. And if that's done, it makes the AEI a lot easier. Now, for those of you that have a facility power shop that has not been entering 487s for the entire year of 2022, the best practice is to get those 487s back entered so that they do have 12 months. Otherwise, you're just going to have to make sure that you collect the runtime for the months that they don't have 487s entered for, okay? So this year's kind of a weird year where you're going to have maybe some things that use the IC engine log and then some things that use the IC engine or populate in the IC engine log from the 487 data, okay? Now, that is not all the internal combustion engines that you have to account for. Fire pumps are not always tracked in the facility power module. Aircraft arresting engines are sometimes not captured in there, okay? And then also if you have non-emergency engines. Non-emergency engines, there's not as many of those around, but do make sure that you account for your fire pumps and barrier engines, okay? And if you don't know if you have aircraft arresting engines, if you have fighter planes at your base, you have aircraft arresting engines, okay? So general rule of thumb. But the Power Pro shop would know about the fire pumps and the aircraft arresting engines. So talk to them, okay? We already kind of discussed to review your algorithm association. A few years ago, there was an update to that. Sometimes people can make a mistake on the rated horsepower or the model year, liters of displacement. Just it's good to review that data and just make sure that you're using the correct emission factor set. The next thing is all the 487 data is entered automatically into the IC engine log. So for internal combustion engines, it's not recommended to use the AEI throughput screens, but to look at the IC engine log and make sure that the data that was entered through the 47s doesn't look especially odd. I mean, they may have fat fingered something. So do your due diligence and make sure that there's nothing that stands out as abnormally high. You don't have a 1,000-hour maintenance run because somebody went to put one in and then, rested their elbow on the keyboard. Okay. So double check those. And then for the fire pumps and aircraft arresting engines and non-emergency, make sure you do enter IC engine records for that. And make sure you've got the runtime operation and things like that. Now, potential data sources, and I know this has been a problem with the utilization report, is that a lot of tenant organizations weren't necessarily entering it, but they did have engines. So Power Pro is going to be the first place that you need to stop for any questions with engines, but also your hospitals and clinics are going to maintain their own engines. Traditionally, Facility Power or Power Pro does not maintain those, so you're going to need to talk to them. Sometimes the BX and commissary manages their own engines. You may have tenant or contractors that you need to include in that as well. Sometimes the fire department, sometimes security forces will have an engine that they put out at the gates. Now, security forces is one that I would always kind of be aware of. It's pretty common that if they have an engine fail at one of the gates, that shoots up the barriers, they'll bring in a temporary one. And those temporary ones sometimes end up staying there for a really long time. And if you know anything about engines, if that engine stays in that same place for 12 months, it's now a stationary engine. So they may have taken a mobile power unit over there, but if it sat there for 12 months, you need to be accounting for it, okay? So just be aware of some of these other areas that may have sources, okay? Any questions about AECOM? Okay. All right, surface coating. So surface coating depends on your regulatory posture. Okay, some installations don't have very stringent regulations. They may not have any paint booths, but other ones have paint booths that have things like hourly rolling totals or daily rolling totals, weekly. And in that case, the ESO-MIS data is not going to be feasible for you to use. So ESO-MIS largely operates on a consume on receipt model, which means the second that material is purchased and handed out to the shop, they assume that entire gallon or entire container of paint was used that day, that minute. So if you have hourly rolling totals, that would spike and you would bust your limits. And we know that that's not exactly how the paint is being used. And so in that case, most installations opt for manual logs. And that's where the paint operators, they say, okay, at 10 o'clock this morning, I used a pint of this and half a gallon of this, and they just write it down. The air quality shop then has to make sure that they obtain those written records and enter usage for them. Okay, that can be kind of time consuming, but regulatory wise, it's also necessary in a lot of areas. Okay. Now, one of the things that we see with this type of thing, if you do have a paint booth that has manual logs, they are purchasing those materials through ESO-MIS. And so when you're purchasing that and it's coming over in the interface, you don't want to just blindly validate that usage, because if you do, you'll be double counting the emissions from those usage. So one of the best practices that I recommend is, and we're just going to go here, and I'm going to show you an example of how I would handle this type of scenario. So Lackland Air Force Base is in Texas. Texas has hourly rolling totals that need to be calculated. And so what they've done here is, I'm going to look at the Air National Guard paint booth. So they have their paint booth process, which is their next hire process, their roll-up process that's accounting for this. All the manual usage is going to be entered against this process. But what they've done is they've gone in and said that this is the ESO-MIS process that is used to purchase all of the materials for this paint booth, okay? And because they've associated it, now when somebody comes behind, they know either to not validate the consumption from this particular process, or they can do it in another smarter way. So if I know 1119 has the ESO usage, I can come up here and let's look at this process. I can say that I know I am accounting for this usage in manual logs. And so I have set this up to exclude consumption records from the ESO interface, which means I'm telling the ESO interface, do not pull usage over from this process. I don't even want it to come into APIMS because I don't know if I can remember to make sure it's not validated. I don't even want it to come over because I'm already accounting for it in another way. Okay. So this is the best way to handle paint booths with their ESO processes. Okay. And if you don't know which ESO processes feed into the paint booth, go talk to the paint booth shop. They know exactly how they purchase materials. They can pull ESO up and show you exactly which ESO processes they use to purchase all of their materials. Okay, so I highly recommend doing that. Anytime I'm out doing an AEI, I make sure to stop at the paint booth shop. And while you're there, the other thing that you can do is make sure that you've got all of the control devices. So paint booths obviously are going to have some sort of filter or filtration system on them. A common mistake that people make is when they configure the process controls for a paint booth, like let's see here, we can, I don't have the surface coating report up, but they will only account for the particulate or only account for the VOC control, right? But there's a lot of HAPs that are particulate HAPs. And so make sure that you're taking credit for those as well and find out what the control efficiency is of that particular filter. It may or may not make a difference, but as a best practice, you want to make sure that you're taking account for all the controls that you can. And that's one of those data elements that you set it up once, and then it's going to be there year to year, and you only have to update it when it changes. Okay. So that's identify the ESO processes. The next thing is the key data points. So review the algorithm association. I see very often where, and let's just look at the algorithms. So this one, let's talk about this. This one is only calculating for volatile HAPs, right? And it's looking for consumption in what unit of measure? In weight, okay? So it's going to expect it to be in pounds or net ounces, okay? And that's because it's coming over from the ESO interface. So let's go, but this one, because they're excluding consumption, it's okay. Let's go back to the next hire process. So let's look at the auto paint booth. I think this one's probably right, but we're just going to talk about this. So this one does look like it's correct. So they're using manual paint logs for this particular process. And as would be expected with manual paint logs, they're using a liquid volume-based measurement, okay? So I would not expect to see any pounds or net ounces in the usage log for this. The other thing with paint processes that I see a lot is they only will assign 1 or 2 algorithms. But for painting processes, you need your volatile HAPs, your VOC emissions, your particulate HAPs, and your particulate emissions. And they're all different, calculating for different things. So this particular process is supposed to have 4 algorithms assigned to it. In addition to that, you can see here that the transfer efficiency needs to be specified. Does anybody know what the transfer efficiency is supposed to be and how you find out what transfer efficiency to use for that process? Okay, I'm getting crickets. So if you look at the AFCEC stationary source guide, it's going to have a table in it. And I apologize, I don't have it pulled up right now, but it does have a table in it that tells you exactly what the transfer efficiency is for the various types of coating. So 65% is for an HVLP gun. This is going to be the most common thing for paint booths is 65%. Now, if you have a brush and roller process, the transfer efficiency is going to be much higher. I believe that one's in the 90s. It's like a 95% transfer efficiency. So the transfer efficiency is basically of the amount of paint that I'm using, how much of it goes on the material I'm painting and stays on the material I'm painting, and how much of it can go in the air or to the ground. Okay. So that's what you need to double check. So if you have a brush and roller process, the transfer efficiency is going to be higher than if you have an HVLP gun. Okay, so just make sure that you've got that data correct in there. Like I said, this is one of those things that if you take the time to set it up the right way, then each year you just have to double check and say, yep, I'm good. Okay. I'm trying to think if there's anything else. Now, one thing that you can do, and we're going to talk about the ESO processes, is you're going to have some ESO processes that feed into paint booths. So in that case, you want to roll them up to the paint booth, and you may or may not use the usage from that, okay, depending on what your regulatory posture is. But then the other thing that I like to do, and I talked about this in the ESO training earlier this week, is if I have an ESO process that has a lot of paint, I know a common practice is just everything that doesn't go into a paint booth just goes to Miss Chem, okay? I don't like to do that. If I have a process that really is just for painting, painting lines on the floor, doing architectural painting, spray paint, touch-up painting on things, we'll take those and roll them up to a base-wide surface coating process. So just like my Miss Chem, I'll have a base-wide surface coating process, okay? And the transfer efficiency for that would be somewhat higher than what an HVLP gun would be, okay? So when I set up the processes, I have a miscellaneous chemical process, I have a base-wide miscellaneous surface coating, and then I have all my individual paint booth surface coatings as well, okay? And then potential data sources, if you're new to the Air Force or you're new to this, some of these are very formulaic. So if you have an aircraft structural maintenance shop that's office symbol MXS, they're most likely going to have a paint booth. Same with corrosion control. They're going to have a paint booth. Vehicle maintenance is going to have a paint booth. Aerospace ground equipment is often going to have a paint booth. So double check and make sure that you're taking into account all the data sources for surface coating, and that you're aware of the paint booths that you have on your installation. And more importantly, know what your regulatory requirements are. One of the things is if you're in Texas, it may not, and even if you have a Title V, it may not be in your permit that you need to track paints like that. But Texas is one of those areas that has a permit by rule, which means if you have a surface coating process that's a paint booth, you have to meet hourly rolling totals. And so it's a state regulation. So make sure that you understand, what am I subject to? What kind of tracking do I have to do? Now, with that being said, if you're a small base in a state that doesn't have that kind of regulatory thing, I'm trying to think of, let's say you're in Wyoming, chances are the consume on receipt ESO data is just fine, and you can just roll it up into your paint booth and calculate it that way. Okay. So surface coating is one of those where you kind of have to understand what your individual installation situation is, but don't do more work than you need to. Okay. So keep it simple and as simple as you can. Any questions about surface coating? Okay. Everyone's favorite, fuel transfer and storage tanks. Okay, so this one is probably the most misunderstood. It is often not accounted for fully. There is a report that will kind of show you where you're at with it. If you come in here to quality assurance fuel tracking, if I can open that. So when we're talking about fuel transfer, the fuel is moving around the installation, right? So you shouldn't have a big spike in storage tank throughputs and almost no fuel loading, right? Because that means you put a lot of fuel in your tanks, but like, where did it go? You need to account for where it went. And so this report goes and separates fuel by fuel. And these look good. They're very similar. So basically what went into my tanks was dispensed out of my tanks, right? Oftentimes I will see where the tank throughput is really high and there's no fuel loading. It means you forgot to enter it or they forgot to account for it, okay? So this is a report that can kind of give you a quick check by process and compare what happened from loading to tanks, okay? It kind of helps you understand how fuel is moved around your installation. Now, when I go talk to the fuels management flight or the POL shop, I take this drawing with me, obviously without the gallons on there, but I say, okay, these are the POL tanks at the bulk fuel yard. How much of it went through the hydrant system to the aircraft? And then I write the number down here. Okay. How much of it went to refueling trucks? And then those refueling trucks, how much went out to organizational tanks? How much of it went to the, gas station on the installation? And when you talk to the POL shop and you say, I need to know throughputs, they may or may not understand that. Throughputs may mean something different for them. They talk about things in terms of issues and receipts. And so I find that when I take this picture to them, it's very clear what kind of numbers I'm trying to get for my AEI. And then much like what I showed you that Cape Canaveral did, and let's just go back to that slide. Sorry. Go back to that slide. This is very typical of what you will get from, the CE Fuels shop, right? Is issues and receipts. And at that point in time, then you can say, okay, I know if I'm getting this number from them, it means this to me. So I know that the receipts is really the throughput, right? So you can see how we've done that. Now the issues are going to be your loading and dispensing, okay? And so once you go through this exercise and get on the same page with the POL shop, it makes it so much easier. And then you can name your processes. And actually, I'm going to go back to that email. You can name your processes: gasoline dispensed at GOV fuel station, diesel transferred storage tank to truck. And then everybody's on the same page and your processes are all named in the same formula way. And it just saves a lot of time and makes your AEI a little bit more accurate. Okay. So I highly recommend you use this. Also know that if you have an AFE station that you need to account for, that's the other thing. Sometimes the AFE station is on a different permit. So make sure you understand who is regulatorily responsible for their AFE station emissions. You'll need to go talk to the AFE station. POL and base fuels will not have that information. Okay. Any questions about fuel transfer? Has anybody run into problems with fuel transfer and storage tanks? The other thing is storage tanks, if you have, you notice I'm looking at the bigger storage tanks here. We don't need to capture usage for storage tanks that are probably 1,000 gallons and less. It's not going to be worth your time, and you're really not going to be able to do it accurately anyway. So you need to focus on the bigger tanks. You want to make sure you get the POL yards. You want to get the tanks that are 10,000 gallons, 5,000 gallons, that kind of thing. Any of these belly tanks for the engine, first of all, you're not really going to be able to get a good, accurate accounting of it. And secondly, EPA tanks won't even calculate for a tank that's below, I think, 250 gallons. Okay. The model just doesn't hold up. So the emissions are considered de minimis in that regard. Okay. And then obviously gasoline tanks are going to emit a lot more than diesel or jet fuel tanks. Okay. So make sure that you focus on just the big emitters. And that's where this AEI collection summary report can come in handy. So as you can see, I've got all of these tanks here because the tanks manager has to keep everything that's 50 gallons or above in APIMS. Okay, so that's going to give me a lot of processes that I don't track usage for, which could lead to inconsistent usage recording. Okay, but if you use this usage report, it's going to show you which tanks you track usage for on a year-to-year basis, and you can focus on making sure that you're consistent about which tanks you calculate for. Okay. Any questions about that? Okay. All right, so those are some of the sources that cause the most problems, some of the sources that have the most emissions with them. So we want to make sure that we spend a reasonable amount of time making sure that those are accurate. I said it before, I'll say it again. We want to compare the usage to previous years. It should be similar. It should be within a reasonable amount of deviation, right? You shouldn't have twice as much usage this year as you did last year, unless it's a really small number, right? And if somebody gives you a number like that, ask them about it. Now, like AECOM, for example, if you had, 10 million BTUs that you use, or 10 million cubic feet that you used this year, and then next year you used 150, I'd ask them, I was like, hey, what's going on? It could be, well, there was a winter storm, or I think one of the scenarios we had at one point in time was there was an installation that had a spike in AECOM emissions because the natural gas supplier for the base became unreliable, and they had to switch over and use their diesel boilers a lot more. They were dual fuel boilers, and so they had to use their diesel backup for a larger amount of the year, which significantly increased emissions, right? And so just make sure that when you get the data, you look at it, you say, does this look reasonable to me? And if not, start asking questions. It could be that they just gave you the wrong piece of information, right? So just kind of apply a little bit of logic to it. And then make sure the units of measure match the units required by the algorithm assigned. And if you don't know what units the algorithm assigned is asking for, you can look at it in that calculation tab. It'll tell you if it's supposed to be weight or volume. And then we're going to show you something in a report that will kind of give you a hint that you've got a problem. The other thing is utilize the AEI throughputs screen for data entry for most of your sources. That will make data entry for all of the usage a lot faster, except for AECOM. Utilize the IC engine log for that one, please. And jet engine testing, you want to use the jet log for that. And then once again, storage tanks are all separate. You're going to have a separate storage tank throughput and separate storage tank calculation. So don't forget to run your storage tank emission calculations, okay? And then the last thing about usage before I jump into the usage summary report is that if you have a source that is still active, still installed, still on base, but just didn't operate during that time frame, I highly recommend you enter 0. That way, I went and saw it, I confirmed it didn't run, but I'm also confirming that it has the potential to run in the future. Okay, so negative documentation is sometimes as important or more important than an actual usage record. Okay, and I'll talk about that again here in a minute when I talk about the usage summary report. So let's go into business objects. Once again, we're going to come into the quality assurance folder, and there is a usage summary stationary report. Now, I'm not going to refresh it. It's going to be for whatever base happened to have it run. I've got an export of it that I can kind of call it out. The first report, so the way I suggest you use this report is once you have entered most of the usage or all of the usage or all you think you're close to being done, you can run this report and it'll tell you all of the usage that has been entered for that particular time frame. So this is a good way to look for any data anomalies and just kind of say, okay, this is where I'm at. This is how close I am to being done and accounting for all of the emissions or the usage. It'll let you know when you're ready to start running calcs, right? Okay. The next report is missing usage. So this is going to go look at all of the active sources that don't have a usage record for the time frame specified. Okay. Now, this does not mean you have to have a usage record for it. It just gives you a guideline to say, look at these processes and see if you need to. So like we talked about before, these are all small storage tanks. I would not expect a usage record for them. So they're showing up on this report, but because I know what I know, I'm not expecting usage for it. And then these bottom two processes, I'm not expecting usage for either. So let me actually pull up. So this Excel spreadsheet is for Yokota. Yokota is in the middle of doing their AEI. I know for a fact that they have entered some usage, but they haven't entered all the usage that they need, okay? So I pulled it while they were still working on it. So if I go to the missing usage, this can be a good reminder that, oh, you know what? I forgot about the glove box in building 906. ABCL, that's one of those sources that's really easy to forget about, especially when you're in the time crunch of an AEI and you're focused on getting this. This report can help you say, okay, I do need to email that guy back and follow up and make sure that I get the usage for that. Or if not, I need to enter a 0 usage record for that, okay? And once again, we're at the ASTs. I forgot about my degreasers. I need to go make sure I've got all the degreasers. I still have the fire training to take care of, right? And so this can be kind of a good working list to check your progress as you're doing an AEI. Now, the next several reports they're a little bit odd, but we have seen errors with them. And so it was an easy report to check that we didn't have negative usage records. We didn't have usage entered with an end date before the start date. If you do this, the most common way is with an API upload, which I know some of the bigger installations use, your usage won't count in your calculations, right? Same thing with usage spanning over 365 days. You get in a hurry entering dates, and instead of 2022, you put 2202. Okay, in that case, it's only going to use a fraction of the usage that you entered for this particular year. Same with multiple years. Okay, so you shouldn't have anything show up on these reports here. Now, the next report that I talked about, I said, make sure that your algorithm is using the right unit of measure. Okay, so here we've got a problem. We have an ESO process for vehicle maintenance that is assigned Chem 1, and it's got usage in pounds. APIMS does not know how to handle that. APIMS will take this number, assume it's gallons, and apply it to the algorithm. This can cause significant over or under reporting of emissions, okay? So like I said, I see it commonly with chemical usage. I see it commonly with surface coating. Another one that I see it commonly with is abrasive blasting. When you go to, or woodworking, when you go to those shops and they say, we put our waste into this 55-gallon drum, then you put 55 gallons. But what happens is that algorithm is based off of pounds. And so in order to accurately estimate that, you need to know the density of the wood or the density of the abrasive blasting, okay? And so in that case, you need to make sure you're entering it in the right thing. Now, there's going to be things on this that are maybe not bad, like munitions. It's going to say round or each. It'll show up as an error, but you have to have the good sense to look at it and say, okay, no, I know that one's okay. But here's another one. We're talking about firefighter training. Pallets. The algorithm's looking for pounds, and they're giving you each. So they burn 300 pallets. My guess is 300 pallets weighs a lot more than 300 pounds, right? And so this report can be very useful in catching errors before they get to the emission stage. Yeah, this is what I was talking about here. 220 gallons. So they basically said, I emptied that 55-gallon drum X number of times and put that as the usage, but really we need to multiply by the density of those wood shavings, right? Okay, so APIMS is really good about taking numbers and spitting out numbers, but it's up to you to make sure that you're doing due diligence to make sure you're giving it the right numbers so that the right numbers come out, okay? And then the next one is processes with usage and no emissions. So this is another common mistake. I have a new source on the installation. I calculated, I documented the usage, but I didn't get any emissions from it. Okay, well, the reason is you forgot to add it to your emission calculation, okay? And so you've got to do that second step of making sure you associate it to a calculation. So that's one of the errors. The other problem that we have, and you can see on here, is I have inactive processes that have usage. So then that begs the question, why does an inactive process have usage? Did I document it against the wrong process? Is the process supposed to still be active? And so it can kind of catch some of those errors that you may have with your usage. And then, like I said, inactive processes that have usage. So I know with tanks, it's one of those where they switch a tank out and there's a new tank process for the new tank, but the shop still has the old code that they enter usage against. I've seen that several times. So these are all very good reports to run while you're doing your AEI, and it can help catch errors a little closer to when you're working the data instead of having to try and track it down at the end when your emissions are different than what you would expect. Okay. All right. Emission calculations. So before I move on, did anybody have any more questions about some of the usage pitfalls, some of the best practices for usage, questions about any particular usage that they've been having trouble with? No? Okay. Emission calculations. I can't stress this enough. Keep it simple. Okay, so the unique combination of source, time interval, and pollutant must be unique to avoid duplication of emissions for a source. Okay, so avoid associating a process to more than one calculation if you can. And I'm just going to kind of show you a couple of examples here. And I apologize to Lackland, but I'm working with them to help clean some of this out. So I'm gonna pick on them for a second. So if I look at this emission calculation structure, I have stationary source emissions, ESO/MIS. That looks good. I've got my surface coating hourly calculation, VOC only, and then no VOC. Those make sense, right? As long as I'm not calculating for VOC for surface coating in one of these calculations, right? Now, ozone season, this one is a little troubling to me. This calculation is calculating for 12 months worth of data. This one is calculating for 2 or 3 months. The better practice is to not use a calculation to get that data, but to use a business objects report. So just have this and have it be a monthly calculation, and then use a report to say, I want to see the emissions from these sources for this time frame. The same could be said with permitted sources. If you have permitted sources that need to be sent to the state, but then you have the comprehensive AEI, you can still do it with one calculation. And then in your business objects report, say, filter it out and say, I only want to see emission totals for my permitted sources. Okay. So seek the singularity. This particular setup with the GHG emissions, the HAP emissions, the annual stationary versus the stationary. If I was a new person coming in, how would I know which process had the right emissions for me to look at? How would I know if I was not duplicating emissions? How do I know which emissions to, or which calculations to associate to my AEI, right? So I would recommend moving some of the smaller granularity that you need for emission calculations over to business objects reports, but to keep it simple when you come in here. So I'm going to show you something that would be a little bit more representative. This is more like what it should look like. Okay, and I know this is an overseas base, so it's a little bit different, but you should have an ESO calc and an annual stationary calc. If you have hourly rolling totals, so like if you're Lackland, you can't get away with 3 calculations. You do need an hourly rolling total calculation, and you don't want to calculate hourly rolling totals for all your sources. And so in that case, you would have a surface coding, but you want to try and get away with the least amount of calculations possible. Another bad habit that I have seen is, and I don't know, I'm trying to think of a base off the top of my head, but people will come in and instead of just having this one, they'll create an emission calculation for 2022 stationary sources. And then they'll come in again and say next year, and they'll create another calc for 2023 emission sources, right? So each year they're creating a new calc, when what they should have been doing is coming in here and just going to the runs tab and creating a new calculation run, right? So try and be consistent about your calculation structure. If you have a calculation structure that is kind of, a mess, I've seen some bases with 400 different emission calculations. And at that point in time, you don't really know what you have. Please reach out to your ISS, RSB. There is support to help get that cleaned up and streamlined, okay? It's going to make your life a lot easier when you're doing reports, when you're doing AEI submittals, and just managing your data, okay? So keep it simple. Now, one way to find out if you are possibly duplicating emissions is we have a report called the duplicate calculation of emissions. So we're going to come back to business objects. And once again, all of this is in the quality assurance folder. And if I go duplicate calculation of emissions, it'll have 2 different reports. One is calculation duplication. So this one, I believe I've got it filtered to demo something. This particular process, so surface coating paint booth, is calculating for ethyl benzene during this time frame 4 times. But for particulate PM, it's calculating it only 3 times. So when I'm submitting an AEI or pulling a report, how do I know I'm not quadruple or tripling my actual emissions? It's really hard to tell, right? Because it's going to give you a number. It's going to total it up and be really smart about it. So I highly recommend you come in and run this calculation duplication and then go to your calculation runs. And I already have it filtered up here for this particular process. And this tells me exactly what the 4 calculations are. So basically what's happening here is this was part of an annual calc. It's part of a surface coating annual emissions. It was part of a HAP emissions that only went from January to September. And then it was part of an ozone season that went from May to September. So if I'm looking at data in July, and I'm not specifying which calculation I want it to pull, I'm quadrupling the emissions of ethyl benzene. And I can tell you at the end of the year, when you're going through all your pollutants and all of your AEI, you will not be able to find this type of error, but this type of error can cost you. Okay. So it's better to just keep it simple and have it clean to start with and make sure that you maintain it clean than to try and have to find this needle in a haystack. Any questions about this? Okay. The other thing I want to talk about is, and let's go back to Lackland real quick. So a couple other things that are really important when you're doing your emission calculations. and I'm just going to grab the annual stationary one, is if it's an ESO one, you want to make sure you're totaling your sub process. You want to make sure that you're adding your new processes and associate them to the calc. So make sure they show up here with a blue checkbox. Otherwise, they'll show up on that usage report. And then the next thing, and this is especially important for ESO MIS calculations, is make sure that you're capturing all the chemicals you need to be calculating for. The ESO MIS interface pulls in new chemicals every single time it runs. Those new chemicals, they may not be the named HAPs that you're used to seeing, but they may be HAP groups, like chromium 3 sulfate, or let's see, phenyl mercuric hydroxide. So some of these are part of those chemical family HAPs. And so AFCEC reviews the chemicals that come in from the ESO MIS interface, and they make sure that they're categorized, whether or not they're part of those group HAPs, and flags them so that they will roll up correctly in your emission calculations. But they're not going to roll up correctly if you're not adding them to your calc, okay? So my best practice is every time I come in and run this, I make sure that there aren't any additional pollutants that I need to account for. Now, the other thing that we have done recently, and for those of you that are in various states, so there's the HAP list, that's the federal list, but then on top of that, there's 28 or 29 states that have their own list of toxics that differs from the federal HAP list, okay? And we've worked really hard to get all of those chemicals captured in here and labeled with the pollutant category of that particular state. The other thing that was done was in your source category, if you come in here to, let's say, chem, and you go to algorithms. Why is it not showing up there? Hold on. Oh, because it's under here. So, whoops, sorry, wrong one. If I go to the HAP algorithm and to the emission factor sets, we have volatile hazardous air pollutants and state pollutants. So what this has done is pulled in all the different chemicals that are on state lists and regulated and included them in this emission factor set, okay? So this is above and beyond the federal HAP list. And if you wanted to wait for it to load, it's quite sizable. But when that means that when you're coming into your emission calculation area and you go to chemicals, you can add chemicals and you can look and say, okay, I am in Texas. I want all the Texas contaminants and I want to search. I can make sure that all of those are attached to my calculation. That way, when I'm reporting to my regulators, I am capturing all of the things that they're asking me to as well, okay? And then come into runs. Now, another thing that people forget to do is they run their calculation and then they submit their AEI. And we'll talk about that in the next class next week about quality assurance, quality control. But one of the things that needs to be done while you're doing your AEI is to come in and look at the messages tab. This is going to tell you about problems that you have. For example, here, there's no algorithms assigned for 4 different processes. So let's go look at what that is. So it's going to give me the process ID and say that it's not going to calculate any emissions because there's no algorithm assigned. Okay, then you've got other ones that are percent solids, VOC content. Those are things that maybe need to be resolved with the data stewards in ESO MIS. I have no usage records found for 17 sources. Now, it may be that they didn't run, but this is where the 0 usage record comes in handy because then you know I didn't just forget something and I'm not accounting for something. Here's another one with a bad start date, right? It was not used. So you can go look and say, what's wrong? Why did these not get included? So that's really the last step in looking at that emission calculation, okay? And I talked about this a little bit before, utilize the same calculations from year to year. It will be a lot easier to compare emissions from year to year and troubleshoot. don't have permitted sources or ozone season or HAP emissions to have extra calculations, do that in the business objects reporting layer. And then make sure to include all pollutants for Air Force and regulatory reporting. Review the error messages, quality assurance, quality control. I believe that training is on Wednesday of next week, and the link it's up there in SurveyMonkey. Okay, so I highly recommend that everyone attend that as well. I know this was kind of a fast-paced thing, but it was really just supposed to highlight some of the changes that have happened, some of the tips and tricks, and some of the tools that are out there that can hopefully make this AEI season go a little bit smoother for you. Does anybody have any questions? I have time. I can field questions that are related to your specific installation, if you're working the AEI, or also any of the topics I have covered. And with that, I'm going to actually stop the recording now so you feel a little bit more apt to talk. So thank you, everyone. Okay, the recording is